There's this never-ending conversation that basically just happens in talking points. Everybody just says their talking points and then we never get anywhere. And it has to do with mass shootings and supposed good guys with guns. And the way it usually works is someone will ultimately say after some shooting, the reason that this shooting happened or was as deadly as it was is not too many guns or too much access to guns. It's too few guns. We need more good guys with guns so that they can either prevent or more quickly stop these mass shooting incidents. Now, this, of course, ignores that most shooting incidents are not mass shooting incidents. They're individual homicides and suicides. But putting that aside for a second, someone will then inevitably come back and say, well, where were the good guys with guns? Because a lot of these shootings are happening in places where it is relatively easy to get a concealed carry permit, for example. They didn't stop the shooting. And then the pro-gun side will come back and they'll say, well, it was a gun-free zone, which only prevents good guys from having guns. The bad guys are going to ignore the rules and bring the guns anyway. And then we never get anywhere. So let's sort of try to step back from the generalities of those talking points for a second and talk specifically about Texas and Ohio in these particular cases. And disclaimer, this video is going to be demonetized by YouTube. As I told you yesterday, all week, we've been trying to have serious adult conversations about crime and violence in society. Those stories are all instantly demonetized by YouTube. This is probably our 12th demonetization this week. So the reality about the good guy with a gun is that he can rarely, if ever, stop a mass shooting. This got traction after Sandy Hook in 2012. The NRA's then vice president, I don't know if he still is, Wayne LaPierre, said the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And then people started talking about arming teachers and guns in more places. And it just doesn't work. It's not even a myth. It's really a delusion. The reality is the opposite of the talking point. In a ton of cases, armed so-called good guys with guns in public places are likely to make mass shootings worse. Experts agree, okay? Stanford law professor John Donahue says, quote, unless you're very well trained, this means like military level training, you usually add more to the body count than you subtract. You don't need to think too imaginatively to understand why this is. There's a bad guy with a gun, starts shooting. 30 to 60 seconds later, a good guy with a gun, if he can even figure out what's going on and who to shoot, starts shooting back. Another 30 to 60 seconds later, like in Ohio, where police responded very quickly, police show up, they see two people shooting, and now there are two guys with guns that police have to assess who's good, who's bad. Police required to fire more shots to take down the bad guy, if they can even figure out who that is, of which there are now possibly two as far as police are concerned. It's chaos. It leads to more injury. It leads to more death. So then now let's look more specifically at Texas and Ohio. In the last few years, both states have expanded gun rights. They've made it easier to concealed carry. In Ohio, 2017, you can then you were then allowed to start bringing guns to daycare centers on private planes. Employees are allowed to bring guns in Ohio to company parking lots, for example. In Texas, 10 new expansive gun laws that we discussed on the bonus show this week are being added almost as we speak, fewer than 4 weeks from now. And meanwhile, we see that armed civilians responding to mass shooters in public places to prevent shootings basically don't exist. You'll hear some few anecdotal cases, but even in cases where someone with a gun starts shooting back, hypothetically, the shootings typically last very little time, 30, 60 seconds of actual shooting. Sometimes you do get a few minutes. No one reacts the way they think they would. Even police who are trained often don't react as expected. And in a chaotic live shooter scenario, the good guy with a gun is simply another guy with a gun to police. Joe Hendry, the director of risk assessments and a national trainer at the Alice Training Institute, says, quote, it's a very difficult thing to shoot in a room that's full of people while someone is shooting at you. When police show up, the shooting is underway or it's over. More shooters in these scenarios do not help. When even police don't react as training would dictate they should, what do you think the average person is going to do? The average person, even with gun safety training and even some response training, will either do nothing or they will panic and shoot the wrong people or get themselves shot by police when police arrive. Security guards, they're not military, they're not police. We're talking about guards in schools, armed guards in schools. Can you imagine? And then think about scenarios where it doesn't even make a difference. Look at the Las Vegas shooting. What good were good guys with guns to stop a guy in a hotel room with high-powered weapons? Ohio itself, look at what happened in Ohio over the weekend. Near instantaneous response by trained police. The entire thing lasted a minute. The guy killed a ton of people, and some people call it the good guy with a gun myth. It's really a fantasy or a delusion, as I said earlier. The number one thing we can do to fix the gun issue and gun deaths is fix our culture so that fewer people see guns as the way to solve a problem or prove a political point or as an outlet for distress that they're experiencing. When they say, let's talk about mental health as the cause, well, then fund it. You can't say the issue is mental health and then do nothing to increase access to mental health treatment. And by the way, I mean, I don't even want to get into this, but if the issue is mental health, as some claim it to be, you then need a system to block people with certain conditions from having guns, which many Republicans are against anyway. And it also opens up a very, quite frankly, complex conversation about which diagnoses preclude you from having a gun. And that's a whole other topic. Would the right be okay with saying anyone diagnosed with adjustment disorder, which is sort of like this catch-all generic mental health diagnosis that's often used merely to get insurance coverage for mental health treatment? Does that preclude you from having a gun? Does anxiety preclude you from having a gun? What about depression? Does anyone on antidepressants get banned from having guns? I mean, the it's a mental health issue ignores, number one, that the people claiming that don't really want to fund access to mental health typically. And number two, that what exactly would be the mechanism and conditions that would preclude you from having a gun? A conversation for a different day.